Welcome to your online lecture for the first part of Chapter 12, the Four Gospels. In this lecture, we're going to look at a few points regarding the Gospel as a genre, then we'll shift our attention to the synoptic problem and some hypotheses that try to address the synoptic problem. The word Gospel comes from the Anglo-Saxon words God spell, which means a story from or about a god, or about something good. The Latin word for Gospel is Evangelium, and the Greek word is evangelion, which means good news. The New Testament uses the term to connote the divine announcement of the final stage of God's plan for salvation, and so the term is unique to the New Testament. Sometime in the 1st or 2nd centuries, Christians applied the term gospel to a literary work proclaiming the role of Jesus in God's saving work as Messiah. So here we find in the gospel a genre which proclaims the role of Jesus in God's saving work. To lend credibility and authority to the works, the Gospels were sometimes associated, perhaps accurately, with apostles or persons close to apostles of Jesus. A number of Gospels were produced, 4 of which were incorporated into the New Testament canon. Extra-canonical Gospels include the Gospels of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, Mary, and many more. We'll talk about that later on in Chapter 15. From a literary perspective, the Gospel as a genre is a grouping of works with similar form, style, content, function, and perspective. However, scholars have struggled to identify just what type of genre the Gospels represent, since they have a biographical framework, but they are not modern biographies. They are schematic and selective, covering only a relatively small portion of the life of Jesus. They are theological rather than historical in their orientation. In other words, the Gospel writers are clearly more concerned with proclaiming what they perceive to be the truth about Jesus in the context of God's plan of salvation than in placing him precisely in the context of his times. Their objective is to present the Christ of faith and not so much the Jesus of history. There have been attempts to compare the Gospels with contemporary Jewish and Greco-Roman genres, but there are no parallels. They are a unique genre. After about 200 years of critical study, we have a widely accepted picture of the stages of development during the years between the death of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels. First, scholars confronted what became known as the synoptic problem. When we compare the outlines and the content of the 4 canonical Gospels, we find 2 intriguing features. First, the Gospel of John is quite different from the other 3. Important events in the life of Jesus that Matthew, Mark, and Luke recorded are absent from John. There are significant chronological and geographical differences. And second, there is a common chronology and geography in the synoptic Gospels. Furthermore, long passages are paralleled in all 3 Gospels. This begs the question, why? How can we explain their interrelationship? This is the synoptic problem. This exercise invites you to compare the story of the rich young man, which you can find in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. These 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are referred to as the synoptics. Synoptic comes from the Greek word for seen together. The term is applied to the 3 Gospels because the 3 Gospels are so similar to each other. What you also notice is that each of the Gospel writers will emphasize different things and structure their Gospels differently. And finally, they'll have their own styles. This graphic shows the relationship between the synoptic Gospels. In purple, we have what's known as the triple tradition. This is material that is in common between all 3 synoptics. Notice how both Matthew and Luke use roughly the similar amount of material from Mark's Gospel. Indicated in blue, we have what's known as the double tradition, and that is material that is common to both Luke and Matthew. The term double tradition can also be applied to material that's in common between Mark and Matthew. In this graphic, that's shown in red. It can also apply to material that's in common between Mark and Luke, and in this graphic, in gray. Many biblical scholars looking at the relationships between the Synoptic Gospels will notice that since Luke and Matthew both use Mark's material, and since Luke and Matthew have the double tradition, material that's in common between the two of them, could there be another source that is this double tradition? Some scholars call this source Q. This comes from the German word Quelle, which means hidden. This is appropriate since the source is hidden to us. You might also notice unique material to each of the Gospel writers. Material in Matthew's Gospel that's unique to Matthew is known as M, and material unique to Luke known as L. You might wonder what was left on the cutting room floor, the 3% that wasn't used by Luke and Matthew of Mark. Of that material is material that both Luke and Matthew refashion and polish in order for them to place it properly in their gospel storytelling, as well as stories that might be problematic. For example, in chapter 14 of Mark, verses 51 to 52, we have this peculiar young man who runs away naked after Jesus' arrest. The suggestion is that Luke and Matthew find that both problematic and unnecessary for their storytelling. For many biblical scholars, because Luke and Matthew draw so heavily on the Gospel of Mark, that Mark must have been written first. This is known as Markan priority. And so, looking at the relationships between the Synoptic Gospels, one has to wonder why. Why are there so many similarities and so many differences? The following hypotheses try to explain why. Each have their pros and cons, and are meant to be weighed based on the evidence. A question to keep in mind as we look at the different hypotheses is, which to you is the strongest, and why? Although still challenged from time to time, the most widely accepted solution to the synoptic problem is the two-source hypothesis. This is named after the two major sources the theory claims were used in the writing of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. The first leg of the theory is that the entire Gospel of Mark served as a source for Matthew and Luke, except for a handful of passages which are largely Mark's editorial contribution rather than substantive traditions. In other words, some biblical scholars suggest that Mark's Gospel was added to later on. As we noticed from the previous slide, all of Mark is duplicated in the other two synoptic Gospels. And when a Markan passage is missing from Matthew or Luke, it is almost always found in the other. Similar to this is the outline of the Gospel of Mark. It seems to be determinative for the other two Gospels. In other words, when Matthew or Luke varies from Mark's storytelling sequence, the other follows Mark. And next, except in a few minor circumstances, Matthew and Luke do not agree against Mark in wording. And so, considered together, the evidence for the dependence of Matthew and Luke on Mark is difficult to refute. The second leg of the hypothesis is somewhat more conjectural, but it is still almost universally accepted among critical scholars. It is the notion that Matthew and Luke share a second common source besides Mark, the so-called Q, or hidden source, or saying source. More than 1/3 of Matthew and 1/4 of Luke consist of material they share in common that is absent from Mark. In that graphic, it's that blue double tradition. Although it is possible that Matthew used Luke as a source, or vice versa, the type of the shared material makes the Q hypothesis more plausible. In other words, the material they share in common consists largely of sayings of Jesus, such as in Matthew chapter 6, verses 22 to 23, and Luke chapter 11, verses 34 to 36. In other words, what they have in common is made of the similar stuff. The high degree of verbal agreement between Matthew and Luke in Q sections makes it likely that Q was a written rather than an oral source. In other words, the material that's in agreement between Matthew and Luke are so similar in wording that they must have had the wording or the source right in front of them. Another argument for the Q source is the discovery of the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, which we'll look at in chapter 15. It's important to note that this is not the Q source, but what it is a collection of sayings, much like scholars think Q was. After all, if we look at this hypothetical Q material, in other words, material that's in common between Matthew and Luke, we find a similar type, that is, sayings, rather than narratives or stories. The third and fourth legs of the two-source hypothesis are the most speculative and the least important. To account for the sections in Matthew and Luke that are unique, it is assumed that each gospel had a special source, designated M for Matthew and L for Luke. Whether Matthew and Luke had separate sources or drew on different oral traditions or written traditions circulating in the early Christian church, M and L are convenient symbols for the special sections of each gospel. Here's a graphic you can find in your textbook that illustrates the two-source hypothesis. Notice the Markan material shown by diagonal lines found both in Matthew and Luke. Notice next the double tradition, that is, material in common between Matthew and Luke, and this is the hypothetical Q source. And then notice, finally, the material that's unique to Matthew and to Luke. Finally, notice the material that's unique to Matthew and the material unique to Luke, known as M and L. This could arguably be the editor's own voice, or it could be a whole other source altogether. The Griesbach hypothesis argued that Matthew, not Mark, was the first written gospel. This was first propounded by St. Augustine. According to Griesbach, Luke used Matthew as a source, along with other material at his disposal, and Mark used both Matthew and Luke as his sources. This theory tries to address the weaknesses of the two-source hypothesis, namely the hypothetical Q source. There are, however, cons to this hypothesis. The first being, if Luke had access to the final version of Matthew, why are there so many differences between Luke and Matthew on issues such as Jesus' genealogy? For example, why would Luke omit some of the important characters in Jesus' genealogy? As well, one would wonder why Luke would remove significant aspects in the circumstances of Jesus' birth, for example, the story of the wise men. As well, if Mark was written later, why would Mark omit such remarkable and miraculous events as the virgin birth of Jesus and his appearance to the apostles following the resurrection? As well, why would Mark want to omit the Sermon on the Mount story? Finally, if Matthew is the oldest gospel, then it has to have been written in Hebrew. However, no such copies of the Gospel of Matthew exist in its original Hebrew. This graphic illustrates the Griesbach hypothesis. Notice Matthew's written first, followed by Luke and Mark. Notice as well no need for a hypothetical Q source. The Ferrer hypothesis argued that Mark wrote first, then Matthew developed and expanded the narrative based on Mark's Gospel. Luke then adapted and supplemented both Mark and Matthew. This view has the virtue of preserving the priority of Mark, or Markan priority, which a comparison of the three synoptic gospel demands, and it explains the presence of Q materials in Matthew and Luke, and therefore removes the need for a hypothetical Q source. The biblical scholar B.H. Streeter has 5 arguments against the Ferrer hypothesis. The first is that Luke would not have omitted some of Matthew's texts because they are so striking. Second, Luke sometimes preserves the difficult wording in Matthew's version. In other words, if Luke had difficulty with Matthew's wording, then Luke would have polished it up. Instead, he preserves the difficult wording. Thirdly, Luke follows Mark's story sequence, but does not do the same with Matthew's story sequence. Fourthly, it is noticed that Luke uses Mark's material less well than Matthew does. If Luke is written later according to this hypothesis, then it should be much better polished than Matthew and Mark's version. This graphic illustrates the fair hypothesis. First, Mark's Gospel, then followed by Matthew and Luke. Notice how the fair hypothesis preserves Markan priority. As well, it does not require the hypothetical Q source. All three hypotheses represent attempts by biblical scholars to understand in descriptive terms how the synoptic Gospels assume their present form. They remain subject to revision or replacement if and when a better explanation is devised. A summary of the hypotheses as well as a discussion of their pros and cons stands as a good candidate for an exam question. There are other problems when we look at the relationship between the Gospels. For example, if there is a literary relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then what of the view that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus? For example, if Luke claims to be an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, then what do we make of the same story being told in Matthew and Mark differently? Another question is, what evidence is there that these traditions circulated independently before the stage of sources and written Gospels? In other words, how do we even know that the Gospel of Mark, in whatever form, was passed around from community to community and then used by Luke and Matthew? And finally, what were the situations in the life of the early Christian church that caused these traditions to develop and to be transmitted? In other words, what are the contexts out of which the stories and Gospels emerge? The literary method known as form criticism is applied to deal with these questions. If you recall, form criticism looks for clues to the context in which the text most likely functioned at the time of its writing and even earlier at an oral stage. In other words, it asks, what genre is this? Form criticism assumed that the stories about and the sayings of Jesus were not kept alive merely to perpetuate his memory, but also to serve the needs of the community seeking to follow him as Lord. In general, these situations would have included communal worship, teaching of children and converts, debate with Jews and Gentiles, community organization and discipline, and reassurance in the face of persecution. Applying the method form criticism gives us insight into the general social situation of the early Christian community. James Dunn argues that the key point in a story or saying is quickly established in oral memory, perhaps even rehearsed at the moment or soon after, although peripheral details may remain relatively fluid. In other words, a good story sticks and holds because it is loved and repeated so much. From a literary historical perspective, we have come to recognize that the writers of the Gospels were probably neither eyewitnesses nor simple collectors of sources and traditions. Rather, they were creative authors who placed their own distinctive literary and theological stamp on their works. Each Gospel is a literary unit with a coherent plan and purpose. This awareness resulted in the development of redaction criticism. This method focuses on the stage in the growth of the Gospels when they were given their final written shape. The redaction critic looks for the hand of the redactor or editor in the storytelling. Redaction criticism allows us to appreciate the distinctive theological perspectives of each of the Gospels. And now we turn to a literary and theological look at each of the Gospels themselves.